Mus comportu in faux pompioi, ni tout fais l'amour, je vous disais porci, Papa Noël son vin en Jerri.
That was Geraint Jennings from the l'Office de Jèrriais, and I'm Fiona Potney. You're listening to the Bailiwick Express's Christmas edition of its podcast. Flashback 100 years and Jersey people would still be waiting to tuck into their Christmas feast after the big day, nearly 2 weeks in fact. While the island now celebrates the festive season much like the rest of Europe, things used to be very different. One tradition, for example, that has died out is La Longue Veil. I'm going to say this wrong.
La Longue Veil.
La Longue Veil, thank you. Geraint joins me in the studio now to tell us all about it. So, what is La Longue Veil? What kind of festivities did it entail?
Well, what happened in the 19th century in Jersey was imported traditions, quite often from England, but also via England from Germany, such as the Christmas tree and other traditions like the English-style Christmas pudding started coming in, especially into town, first of all, whereas older traditions were kept to much longer in the countryside. And so you had quite an overlap. And so, in fact, that's been going on for quite a while because the Christmas season was actually quite long in Jersey, partly because of the agricultural society with a fallow season in midwinter when there wasn't so much work to do in the fields, and also because of the change of calendar at the end of the 18th century, towards the end of the 18th century, whereby dates moved and the Gregorian calendar was brought in. So for most of the 19th century and into the 20th century, many country people continued to celebrate Old Christmas Day on the 6th of January, partly why everyone was having such a dozy time in 1781 when the French landed and invaded at the Battle of Jersey, because many people were celebrating Christmas still at that time. So it was a long Christmas period involving 2 Christmases, in effect a proper church or chapel one on what became the 25th of December, and then the second Old Christmas Day in January. So the Christmas and New Year festivities sort of blended into a long Christmas season. Think of the 12 days of Christmas, and that pretty much gets it. But the Christmas and New Year season started off with La Longue Veil, the long watch. So it was the custom for country families to get together and have community evenings where they'd sit up late and have some dancing in the kitchen, dancing around the big parlour, or whatever the room they were in. The women folk would be gossiping, presumably, matchmaking, doing their knitting or needleworking. The men folk would be perhaps chopping wood for the fire. And it was an opportunity for the young folk, the young men and the young women, to have a rare chance of getting together and socialising in a formal setting within the families. So these would be got together, and say for quilts or larger craft things, neighbours would get together, as they did for the big agricultural events like the big plough or the threshing. They'd get together and join forces. They'd also join forces for these evening parties in the winter season. But it was especially important on the 23rd of December, La Longue Veil, because the 24th of December was the big Christmas market in town.
So they were getting all their bits and bobs finished up.
Yeah, so the ladies would be finishing up their bits of needlework, which they'd be bringing in to sell. Men packing things up, some woodworking perhaps, whatever craft work or things they'd be bringing in, as well as some of the root crops or whatever they would be bringing in to sell in terms of food to the townsfolk or to, of course, their fellow country folk who were coming into market. And that would be, for many country folk, the only time they'd come into town in the year would be for the Christmas market.
A big day out.
On Christmas Eve. Men would be more likely to come in for regular markets, cattle markets, or exporting potatoes, other produce. But especially for the women, this was the big day out into the big urban centre, because, of course, in the old days when so many women lived more restricted lives centred around the home, and not able to go out so much independently. And it must have been an especially important time, for the young women, especially when it was their first visit into St Helier, into town, to the Christmas market, and the people they'd meet and the things they'd see, and they'd know that they wouldn't be going back into town for another year.
And you mentioned they're getting all of their crafts ready. What type of things would they be making to bring into the market?
Well, it might have been things like clothes pegs and those sort of traditional things, but especially the knitted goods, the embroidered goods, and especially those long winter evenings, chatting away and sewing away and doing something special, adding that value, showing off your needle skills, and for the young women, this was considered one of the domestic skills that you'd show off, and mothers would show off their daughters' needlework skills, because that was part of the matchmaking. These are the skills that the young woman would bring to a marriage, in terms of make, do and mend, and turning out her man, the menfolk, the children in the clothes she'd make and mend and present to be respectable, to have prestige, and all that sort of thing, which was traditional in the old days. But also, this was a chance to start off the Christmas festivities, to have fun, to get those things finished, get them packed off, and prepare for the big family community trip into town to the Christmas market, when hopefully they could sell that stuff and also buy the things they wanted, all the things other people had made, all those little knickknacks and whatever, to go over the Christmas and New Year season, and also see them in to the following year in terms of new clothes, new items, perhaps ribbons, jewellery, adornments, which would be good, because there's a special New Year superstition that if you put on anything new on New Year's Day, that would bring you luck for the rest of the year. So it was a good idea to buy new stuff, at the end of December, and then put it on for the first time, on New Year's Day. But there were things which were unlucky on New Year's Day in Jersey. One, you should do no washing.
Right.
So because
that's a relief.
So no washing, because you risked washing away a member of the family within the year. In any case, it was considered bad luck to do any washing of clothes, any laundry on New Year's Day. And also, I'm afraid it was a bit sexist in the old days, even more sexist than I've already mentioned. It was considered bad luck if it was a woman to be the first person over the threshold on New Year's Day. So you needed to ensure it was a man. Your first visitor, the first person across the threshold of the home, was a man, not a woman. So hopefully now everyone's welcome, whoever arrives on New Year's Day, and we don't bother so much about that sort of thing. But there were other things you shouldn't do, because on when you arrive back from market, from town, wherever you'd been, on Christmas Eve, do not go into the cowshed to check on the cattle around midnight, because it was believed at midnight on Christmas Eve, as it turned into Christmas Day, the cattle knelt down in the cowshed in adoration of the birth of the Saviour. But you shouldn't go and try and see this, see the cows kneeling down in adoration, see this magical thing happening, because it was very bad luck, and you risked being struck dead. The other belief about midnight on Christmas Eve going into Christmas Day was that all water turned in that instant to wine. So if you were getting water from the pump or getting water from the well or water from the stream, it would turn into wine. Of course, other people believed something completely different, was that it turned into blood.
Right.
So it was quite a risky
One slightly
thing.
more pleasant than the other.
Yeah, so going out to collect water or check on the cows at midnight as Christmas Eve turned into Christmas Day, was definitely something which was considered, girded around with tradition and superstition.
Well, on that note, what type of things would people be drinking? Was there a special kind of Christmas or New Year's drink at the time?
Well, of course, most people in the countryside drank cider. They'd make their cider, of course, in the autumn and have a stock of that. And of course, having made black butter preserves all the sweetness of the apples throughout the winter season when no fruit is available, because of course in the days before fridges and freezers and things being flown in or shipped in from abroad, you had to deal with what was seasonal. So very much cider, perhaps heated cider with spices, chaudet, which is like a Jersey eggnog with warm cider and milk warmed and egg and spice beaten together into a sort of a frothy, cidery, milky, eggy drink. I like it. Other people are not convinced. And of course, you'd have things like pitchette, raisin wine. So you'd steep whatever you'd preserved, in alcohol and store this up for the winter. Eau de cannelle, cinnamon, spirit. So using flavourings you had, to preserve, things. And of course, the traditional thing was to have your mug of cider or whatever, and to heat it up with the poker from the fire, and heat that up as a warmed drink.
Lovely. And what might people be eating? I'm assuming that maybe turkey and all the trimmings wasn't necessarily.
Actually, turkeys came in fairly early.
Oh, right.
And we have the old saying, "Ala Saint-Michel de Pido a Noé de Pico." So geese at Michaelmas, which is the end of September, and turkeys at Christmas. So people might eat goose. It's very much the goose season, and if you think of Dickens, of course, in England, of course, geese were traditional, but turkeys were kept and eaten. But what was most traditional for most Jersey people, into the 19th century, especially out in the countryside, would be either roast beef for Christmas, but especially roast pork, because having fattened up the pig, it would be the community or family slaughtering in the week or 10 days before Christmas. So you could have some reasonably fresh meat, and then you'd be salting the rest, making sausages or whatever, to use as much of the pig as possible. But certainly, pork, for Christmas was the treat, and then salted pork kept you, fed and provisioned through the dark
And
months.
what type of dessert might we follow up with?
Right, well, people, fruit, pears would keep. Chaumontel pears were a speciality, and people would also be looking at hazelnuts, Conrad. Apples, of course, would keep into the season, so eating apples as well. Apple pies, bourdelot, the pastry dumpling, apples baked in the oven, very traditional. People would make mervel, Jersey wonders, for Christmas. Rice pudding, very popular, du pudding de riz, and that's very popular across Normandy as targoul, the traditional Norman rice pudding, because rice was brought in because of the trade, because it was quite good, ballast, as it were, and you could easily fill whatever space you had up with rice coming from, the east with other produce, and then unload it. So rice came in, it's not as exotic, it's much more firmly established than it was. Of course, rice pudding with lots of milk. So again, it's that, if you've got cows, you're drinking milk, you're doing that. So vegetables, a lot of parsnips, very traditional at Christmas because parsnips are a very traditional crop. Special ploughs in Jersey for ploughing for the depth for planting parsnips, which is why the community comes together for the big plough, because you need the depth of ploughing for parsnips. So you need a bigger plough, so therefore you need the community, various farms to come together and in turn use the big plough with the extra horses required as a community effort. So with the agricultural round of the year, you're preparing, you're planting, you're harvesting, and then preparing for the darker winter months to ensure that you've had a good harvest and you can see your family and your community through and also enjoy it, even though there's very little fresh in terms of what to eat. And of course, as the 19th century went through, you had the traditional English-style Christmas pudding to replace the older pudding noir, the pudding fieur, which is a lighter steamed pudding, doesn't need to be done in advance. So you can make it at the last moment and just steam it for a couple of hours on the day. It doesn't keep like an English-style Christmas pudding, but you can do it at the last moment, and that's traditional. And of course, with cream, that definitely means you're using those dried fruits, the spices, and a slightly lighter golden steamed type pudding rather than the very heavy keeper, which must be made in advance and left to mature, of the English-style Christmas pudding.
Sounds like a lovely alternative. What might we be hearing in the background here? What type of Christmas tunes might be the soundtrack to the festivities back then?
Not Christmas carols traditionally in the, as they're so well known now. They started coming in, being brought in from English tradition, really, in the churches and chapels. But not so much at home. It would be the traditional dancing tunes, and the traditional instrument heard would be the shifurni, the hurdy-gurdy, which was the accompaniment for dancing. But there'd be many chapel families which did not approve of dancing, especially on religious occasions. So we know some dancing went on, but it wasn't considered very respectable. And we certainly know of at least one very non-respectable dance, which was done on these occasions and wasn't to be really discussed in polite society.
What type of dance are we talking about?
Well, it's rather odd dance involving women tying their aprons around their legs and therefore then sort of hopping around the room until they fall over in a sort of a heap. It's like a dance of misrule and implies sort of love charms and things you shouldn't be doing. So we know some of this went on, and that's some of the difficulty because obviously some of the imported traditions are well recorded and described, but some of the traditional ones were sort of kept within families and people knew and they did them, but they didn't write them down for publication. So reviving some of these traditions, sometimes we get a mention. And we know that there's at least one mention of people being wished a happy old Christmas Day into the 1920s in the newspapers. So it must have gone on longer than that. And there's also a mention that children were out begging for their Christmas treats, more than way in St John into the 1950s. We know this was still being done in St Juan at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, up to the First World War. But this was a tradition that at Christmas, after Christmas, New Year, children would go around the neighbourhood. It's basically like trick-or-treating, which is done at Halloween now. But children would go round from house to house of the neighbours, and there'd be a chant, Noël, Noël, mon Noël, sur vos pieds, un morceau de gauche sur le bulle. Christmas, Christmas, my Christmas, please, a piece of cake from the end of the shelf. So they'd be begging for leftovers from the Christmas feast from the wealthier or more well-to-do households, and begging for what was left over. And one has to assume that, as with trick or treat, the families of the neighbourhoods would be sure to have something prepared for the local children, whether it was a bit of cake or whether it was some pastries or some fruit or whatever. Certainly this tradition of visiting was something which was kept up in country areas, whereas in the 19th century it was the urban traditions in town. Children growing up in town were much more familiar with the Christmas trees and the decorations and these sorts of English customs coming in. Although some of the French customs in terms of Epiphany were familiar, and so you had the English traditions coming in as well as the French traditions of Epiphany tying up with the old Christmas Day and the traditional Christmas celebrations in Jersey. So very much a mixture, and obviously families would have their favourite types of tradition, and if they were visiting they'd enjoy their different things, with so many sort of mixed families with either French, Breton or Norman members of the family, English, Scottish, Irish, Welsh, whatever members of the family are all bringing to the mix. And nowadays, of course, we have other traditions, and interestingly with Orthodox Christians now significant among our population, those who celebrate Christmas like the Russians and some Belarusians on the 7th of January are helping us remember that Old Christmas Day also used to be in January for us.
And if there was one old Jersey Christmas tradition that you could bring back and take to the whole island, what would you choose?
I think it would be the Christmas chant, because that would be very easy to introduce to carol singing, the old seasonal chants about Noël, Noël, mon Noël, s'il vous plaît, un bolse de gauche sur le bulle. So just if you can chant that along with the Christmas carols, you can have something new, and just having something simple, a phrase which tells us about what people used to do, but also is a wish to have our piece of cake, our leftovers from off the shelf during the Christmas period, and to be like an old country child from all those years ago once again.
And finally, can you teach us, how do we say we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year in Jèrriais?
Right, so Christmas in Jèrriais is Noël.
Noël.
So the OU in Noël is like the OU in Wayne and St. Juan. So it's Noël. And we've got another one in bon, which means good. So there's two words in there. So bon Noël. Bon Noël means literally good Christmas, Merry Christmas. And then année is the length of the year. So we'd wish someone a good year, a happy new year. It's bonne année. Bonne année. So bon Noël, Merry Christmas, Happy Christmas, Good Christmas, et bonne année and good year. So bon Noël et bonne année.
Geraint Jennings, thank you. If you've enjoyed listening to this festive edition of the Bailiwick Podcast, please like and share it with your friends, family and anyone else you might want to spread a little bit of Jèrriais joy to. And if you fancy taking a deep dive into some of this year's biggest stories, why not listen back to some of our previous editions? You can find them in all of the usual pod places. The jingly version of our title track was I Shift My Weight by Luno. From me, Fiona Potney, and all of the Bailiwick Express team, wishing you a wonderful Christmas and New Year. Bonne nuit et bonne année.